In 1882, an old woman was living on a hill on the outskirts of Springfield, Illinois. She kept her curtains drawn, never went outside, never received visitors. Neighborhood children pointed up at her window and hurried past, frightened by the crazy lady in the upstairs room. 40 years before, she had been married in the parlor of this same house to a tall, awkward lawyer, and still wore his ring, inscribed with the words, "Love is eternal." Once, she had been the most eligible young woman in Springfield, the pampered daughter of Kentucky aristocrats.
My wife is as handsome as when she was a girl, and I, a poor nobody then, fell in love with her. And what is more, I have never fallen out.
He had been a dirt farmer's son, determined to make something of himself in law and politics.
He is to be President of the United States someday. If I had not thought so, I never would have married him. For you can see he is not pretty.
Their marriage survived sharp differences of personality and temperament, endured the deaths of children. They reached the White House as partners. But the Civil War that tore the country apart divided them as well. In the end, an assassin's bullet plunged Mary Lincoln into grief and madness, and made Abraham Lincoln, the obscure prairie politician who had pledged to love her forever, into a legend. The story of the real Abraham Lincoln has receded so far into the nation's memory that what remains seems little more than a dream. The man Mary Lincoln knew and loved and mourned has faded into myth. He was born February 12, 1809, in a cabin in the Kentucky wilderness. But Lincoln remembered little of his life there, and what he did remember, he didn't care to talk about.
It is a great piece of folly to attempt to make anything out of my early life. It can be condensed into a single sentence from Gray's Elegy: the short and simple annals of the poor.
Lincoln's childhood world is mostly gone, except the land around Knob Creek and Sinking Spring Farm, and the stories people still tell there.
I have listened to tales about Lincoln my whole life. I listened to my aunts, my dad, everybody was some way or another talked about Lincoln all the time. My grandmother, she was born in 1885 and got to talk to a gentleman that his parents played with Abraham Lincoln and his sister when they lived here. And he told stories. Different people around here kind of passed them down. They may be twisted one way or another, but they're fairly accurate, we think. We can't be gospel because there are not very many records back then.
Neighbors remembered very little about Abraham's mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln. Some said she used to sing him mournful Scottish ballads. Lincoln himself once told a friend she was an intellectual woman, sensitive and somewhat sad.
I don't think we know a lot about Lincoln's mother.
I see her as a soft-spoken, reflective person. They claim she was, thin, she was tall, dark-haired. Those were descriptions that people that knew her gave. So you assume, then you get your own picture.
They all agreed that she was, quote, intellectual. I don't know what that means in the old recollections. I think it meant that she must have thought about things carefully and talked rather well.
Her communication with Lincoln would seem to have been, at an early age, one of telling stories. It's certainly interesting that all of Lincoln's great writings were written to be read aloud. They're all basically oral communications, pieces of poetry, political poetry.
Abraham's father, Thomas, could barely read or write. One neighbor remembered him as a plain, unpretending, plodding man. Year after year, Abraham watched his father work the fields, tied to the land, at the mercy of the seasons.
It was tough, but it was tough for everybody at the time. You got to understand that there were several families all living on Knob Creek at the same time, and they were all more or less equal. They were poor, but they were equal. And probably they didn't realize they were poor because that's the way that was on the frontier. A boy would have a lot of responsibility then. I would imagine Lincoln came back in this valley looking for berries, hickory nuts, walnuts, probably herbs to make some of their medicine with, and maybe swim and try to catch chipmunks. I mean, that's just what boys do, We run the hills, and he was there. I'm sure I've stepped in his tracks many times.
The Lincoln cabin stood alongside a wilderness road. Abraham could listen to travelers tell stories of the wider world and see slaves driven south to be sold.
His mother and father were much opposed to slavery. They belonged to a fundamentalist Baptist group that was anti-slavery. And he undoubtedly got from them a sense that slavery was wrong even before he'd ever seen slaves or knew about slavery. He said later on that there's never been a time when I was not anti-slavery. And I think that is true.
When Abraham was 7 and his older sister Sarah was 9, the Lincolns packed their few belongings and set out in the dead of winter for Indiana. Thomas Lincoln had always disliked living in a slave state and had grown weary of disputes over the ownership of his land.
It was a frontier area, so unsettled that there was no real road to the plot of ground that Thomas Lincoln laid claim to. He had to cut a path, in effect, for his family to follow.
When they reached their wilderness claim, the Lincolns huddled around a fire. Their nearest neighbor was more than a mile away. Abraham later remembered his terror of the wild animals prowling the undergrowth, the howling of wolves, and the scream of panthers.
The clearing away of surplus wood was the great task ahead. I, though very young, was large for my age and had an axe put into my hands at once. And I was almost constantly handling that most useful instrument.
Life on the frontier was punishing. The ceaseless work, the isolation, and always the threat of sickness and death. In 1818, a mysterious illness spread across the Indiana countryside and found its way into the Lincoln home. Nancy Hanks Lincoln was just 34 when she died. Abraham was 9.
He suffered deeply. This fed in his mind and spirit a kind of fatalism and a dark brooding.
He never got over the loss. For the rest of his life, Abraham would struggle with depression.
She was my angel mother. All that I am or hope ever to be, I owe to her.
The same year that Abraham Lincoln's mother died, 1818, Mary Todd was born on December 13th in Lexington, Kentucky. Surrounded by luxury the young Lincoln could scarcely have imagined.
The world in which Mary Todd grew up could not have been more different from Abraham Lincoln's. She's living in a mansion with several parlors and a dining room, separate bedrooms, servant quarters, a coach house, a beautiful garden in the back. She's got all the clothes that she needs, and she's got all the material resources that one could have needed to feel herself a lucky young woman.
Her father was a wealthy aristocrat, Robert Todd, a descendant of the Todds who had founded Lexington less than 50 years before.
There was a certain trait about all the Todds. They were very proud people. I know they used to say about them, God only had one deity's name, but the Todds had to have two.
All that remains of Mary's mother, Eliza Todd, is a letter she wrote to her grandfather. Little more is known about her, except that she began having babies with what was then described as becoming regularity. The Todds had 6 children. Mary, the fourth, was said to be a lively, free-spirited, impetuous little girl. In 1825, Mary's mother died giving birth to her 7th child. Mary was only 6 years old and had already shown signs of a high-strung, sensitive nature.
So at 6 years old, she's motherless. She took this very hard, according to some of the family legends, and indeed she was going to take all of the deaths that littered her life's course very, very hard.
Only weeks after Mary's mother's death, Robert Todd was looking for a new wife. 6 months later, he proposed to Elizabeth Humphreys. The following year, he married her and began having still more children, 9 of them.
Stepmothering, I suppose, is never easy family business, but in the case of Robert Smith Todd's second wife, it was a disaster. All of the first Todds hated her. Mary is certainly the most rebellious, and there are some family stories of Mary dressing up in her stepmother's clothes and her stepmother calling her Satan's limb.
There were a lot of children in that household, and Mary felt lost. She seemed to have experienced the new mother as hateful and spiteful. Mary became full of rage. She became tantrumy. She couldn't find her place in this household, and she was screaming, crying out for attention.
Mary yearned for her father's attention most of all. She saw in his marriage a betrayal. In the chaos of an ever-increasing family, the little girl was bereft.
You have a feeling with Mary that the wounds festered. And for a young girl who loved attention, who craved attention and needed support, I think there was a great sense of loss that stayed with her the rest of her life.
Mary would one day say that her whole childhood had been desolate. After Abraham's mother died, Thomas Lincoln seemed unable to care for his 2 grieving children. Overcome with misery, he went back to Kentucky, leaving them behind in the care of a cousin. 6 months later, he came home with a new wife, Sarah Bush Johnston, recently widowed with 3 small children of her own.
She came upon this bedraggled little family out in southern Indiana and looked at them and was just appalled. She went to work cleaning them up. She civilized the little family that had been really almost disintegrating. Created a family where there'd been none before.
Abraham flourished under his stepmother's care. Sarah herself could not read or write, but she encouraged Abraham to get what education he could find in the Indiana backwoods. All told, Abraham had less than a year's formal schooling.
There were some schools, so-called, but no qualification was ever required of a teacher. beyond reading, writing, and ciphering to the rule of 3. There was absolutely nothing to excite ambition for education.
But Abraham was ambitious. He taught himself, poring over whatever books and newspapers he could find. His stepmother remembered that he was unusual. He had to understand everything, repeated facts to himself until they were fixed in his mind.
He always regarded himself as quite different from his peers and family, smarter than most of the other people in his environment. There are reports that he could write out documents for what were obviously mostly illiterate neighbors. He would come home from church and he would stand on a stump and then repeat the minister's sermon, but humorously, to the delight of all the assembled children. So that you see a kind of a testing, a sort of an opportunity to be special and unique, which after all he was.
Abe would lay on his stomach by the fire and read out loud to me and Aunt Sarah, a cousin recalled. His father would come in and say, "See here, Abe, your mother can't work with you a-bothering her like that." But Aunt Sarah always said it didn't bother her none, and she'd tell Abe to go on.
She was kind, she was gentle, and she played a really, really important role in carrying him through his adolescence. Psychologically, I think Sarah Bush Johnson saved Lincoln's life.
When Sarah Lincoln was an old woman, someone asked her about her famous stepson. "I never gave him a cross word in all my life," she said. "His mind and mine, what little I had, seemed to move together in the same channel." In the year 1828, when Abraham was 19, he got a chance to earn some money helping take a flatboat loaded with cargo down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. He stood 6 feet 4 inches, strong and wiry, all arms and legs. That same year, his sister Sarah had died in childbirth. One neighbor remembered he was moody, witty, sad, and reflective by turns. He'd never been to a big city. New Orleans would be like nothing he had ever seen. In New Orleans, Abraham saw for the first time human beings bought and sold. In Lexington, sights like that were nothing new to Mary Todd.
Mary would see slaves being chained and brought in a gang. And the auction was right there on Cheapside, which was right next to the courthouse. So it was just a couple of blocks, really, from where they lived.
For Mary, slaves were a constant presence.
She was raised, since her mother died when she was a child, by her Mammy Sally, who coddled her, dressed her, and doted on her. Mary Todd was the daughter of a slaveholder, a Whig banker. So she accepted slavery. She just simply thought it was part of life.
Heated words about slavery and politics flew back and forth across the Todd dinner table. Robert Todd was a slave owner, but he argued against slavery. Mary took her father's part and made clear that she opposed slavery too. Henry Clay was a frequent guest. Leader of the Whig Party, Speaker of the House longer than any other man, he too deplored slavery. Clay burned with ambition to be president, and at 14, Mary was his fiery supporter.
Mary felt that as long as she could go to the dinner table and respond in an interesting way to her father's conversations with his male friends, he would look at her, he would pay attention to her. So she developed very early on an undue sense of understanding and interest in politics, which must have made her a pretty interesting little figure.
As Mary grew to womanhood, she enjoyed parties and shopping for fashionable clothes, and appeared high-spirited.
What we have is an intelligent, well-dressed, somewhat spoiled young girl who was very popular with the boys. On the other hand, we have a young girl who stays in school longer than almost all American women do.
She learned French, she learned English literature, had a classical kind of education.
She was always noted for quoting poetry, great pages of classical poetry. She had an impeccable Parisian accent. For young girls in her world, she was way ahead of them. Despite the emotional difficulties, easily getting lost in this huge household, she made something for herself.
Having just completed my 21st year, we left the old homestead in Indiana and came to Illinois. Our mode of conveyance was wagons drawn by ox teams, and I drove one of the teams. We settled a new place and built a log cabin, fenced and broke the ground, and raised a crop of sown corn upon it the same year. In the autumn, all hands were greatly afflicted with ague and fever. We remained through the succeeding winter, which was the winter of the deep snow.
Another difficult move to a new homestead, another grueling round of seasons. This was not the life Abraham Lincoln imagined for himself.
Lincoln spent most of his early life trying to get beyond his humble origins. He seemed to have to position himself as better than, as separate from, and really not identified with in any way what his father represented. The kind of ignorant past out of which he had come.
He simply did not like the life that his father lived. Whatever happened, he was not going to be like his father. He was going to do something to make a name for himself.
He had a sense of himself as being different from other people from the beginning. He doesn't like farm work. He doesn't make any bones about it. He wanted recognition. He aspires for something more.
At 22, Lincoln left home for good and rarely saw his father again. He never looked back.
I was a friendless, uneducated, penniless boy, a piece of floating driftwood.
Lincoln eventually came to rest at New Salem in central Illinois, population 100, the biggest town he had ever lived in.
He was a gawky fellow, ill-dressed, funny-looking, a rube, they thought. He was rough-looking in a rough-looking crowd.
He simply looked like nothing they had ever seen.
A real hayseed. But as soon as he started talking, you were aware that he was very literate, He was well informed. To them, he sounded educated.
He went to work in a general store and grist mill. But that was only meant to be a stepping stone. Just 8 months after he got to town, he was running for the state legislature.
March 9, 1832. To the people of Sangamon County, I am young and unknown to many of you. I was born and have ever remained in the most humble walks of life. I have no wealthy or popular relations to recommend me. If elected, I shall be unremitting in my labors to compensate. But if the good people in their wisdom shall see fit to keep me in the background, I have been too familiar with disappointments to be very much chagrined.
What was remarkable was that having just arrived in a community where he hadn't really established himself, he should think of himself as a state legislator. They tell something about a driving ambition that this young man had at an early age.
Politics was his way of breaking out of that life that he didn't want to lead. It was the road for a young man to become something in life that other people would respect and understand. Politics was the world that was available to him. Other worlds weren't quite as easily available. That one was right within his reach.
In 1832, Illinois politics was wide open, and Lincoln thought his chances were as good as any man's, even though he had no education and was just 23. He campaigned for the improvement of the Sangamon River. He believed government should promote economic progress. If steamboats could reach New Salem, Lincoln argued, the little settlement could become a thriving port. He never stood much of a chance. Running against older, better-known men, Lincoln lost. But almost all his New Salem neighbors voted for him. He won 277 of their 300 votes. Most people who got to know Abraham Lincoln liked him.
My ever dear Merce, we expect a very gay winter. Evening before last, my sister gave a most agreeable party. Upwards of 100 graced the festive scene.
When she was 20, Mary Todd left behind the stepmother she so disliked and moved to the growing city of Springfield, Illinois. She moved into the hilltop home of her sister, who had married the son of the former governor. She was so charming, so flirtatious, her brother-in-law said, she could make a bishop forget his prayers.
She was amusing and funny. She could quote from Shakespeare, she could quote from the poets, and she was steeped in politics.
In fact, I think she intimidated some of the young men. She was so much smarter than most of them.
She didn't think she was pretty or attractive. She really wasn't. She was aware of her physical shortcomings, but she was attractive enough and young enough and sprightly and intelligent to be quite a sought-after young woman.
She was a girl of much vivacity and conversation, one friend remembered, but was subject to spells of mental depression. She was either in the garret or in the cellar. At 23, Abraham Lincoln had lost his first election, but New Salem offered other possibilities. On the frontier, a man could try his hand at things, change his mind, scramble for a living.
New Salem was Lincoln's college campus. There was a village poet, 2 doctors, a debating society, small industry. He was able to serve in a variety of professions.
Blacksmith, postmaster, surveyor, store owner. He tried them all, and he became everyone's friend. He could beat any challenger at weightlifting, wrestling, horseshoes.
And he loved to tell funny stories. And he called himself a retail dealer because he would take the funny stories from other people, from the humorists whose works he read, but he would tell them in such a way that he would have everyone else guffawing.
He just loved to tell jokes. I mean, he brought stories. He was a great storyteller. He was a Paul Bunyan-esque kind of figure, and it was an absolutely essential part of his character.
You always have the feeling that Lincoln, without being in motion, was not a very attractive sort of fellow, that he was the homely person that people described him as. But the moment he started talking, the moment that voice attached to his heart and to his mind, he became something entirely different. His whole body would convulse with laughter. His gray eyes lit like a lantern. The people in that town grow to respect him. They see him as something more than the shuffling, penniless, gangly character that he appeared when he first walked on the streets.
It's hard to imagine that one wouldn't be attracted to young Lincoln.
2 years after his first try, he ran for state office again.
My politics is short and sweet, like the old woman's dance.
This time, he won. From that moment on, politics would be his life. He was perfectly suited for it. He spoke plainly and had a knack for making friends. He was a member of the Whig Party now and was soon matching wits at the Illinois state capitol with the other lawmakers, making speeches and backroom deals. But to pay the bills, he set out to become a lawyer in the same way he had got most of his schooling, on his own. He was a man of practical ambition, but he loved poetry and spent hours brooding on lines from Shakespeare's tragedies.
Come, sealing night, scarf up the tender eye of pitiful day, and with thy bloody and invisible hand, cancel and tear to pieces that great bond which keeps me pale. Light thickens, and the crow makes wing to the rooky wood.
Lincoln would later write that he pondered the meaning of life with such intensity of thought that he wore ideas threadbare and turned them to the bitterness of death. As Lincoln's neighbors remembered it, the rains never seemed to stop in the summer of 1835, the summer Abraham fell in love. He was already 26, shy, awkward around women. Her name was Anne Rutledge, the 22-year-old daughter of the New Salem innkeeper.
Abraham Lincoln had difficulties in his relationship with women. He liked Anne Rutledge, perhaps the more because he knew she was engaged to another man. This meant that there was no danger in approaching her because she belonged to somebody else.
The details have long since been forgotten, but as time went by, Lincoln and Anne seemed to be drawing closer together. Then Anne became sick with what neighbors described as brain fever, probably typhoid. It was said that she called Lincoln to her bedside. A few days later, she died.
He responded to the loss of what seems to have been his first love with great despair, because it had to have evoked the sudden and tragic loss of his mother. And he was adrift. He was really adrift.
He went into a sustained period of melancholia, seemed even emotionally unbalanced by the loss, unable to function for a long period of time.
His friends feared that he would never recover, that he might even kill himself. They were astonished to find the tough young man from the backwoods so tender-hearted, so undone by the loss.
He was strong, he was resilient, he could take on anybody, he wasn't afraid of anything, but he discovered something that really had the power to knock him for a loop. He had to cope with this vulnerability that he didn't even know he had.
He told one friend he could not bear the idea of rain falling on Ann's grave. When he was 28, Lincoln packed everything he owned into 2 saddlebags, borrowed a horse, and said goodbye forever to New Salem, the town that had given him his start. He was headed to the new Illinois state capital at Springfield. He had twice won re-election, become a Whig party leader, and had finally become a lawyer. He was, one friend remembered, a rising man. By the time she was 21, Mary Todd was one of the most popular young women in Springfield, courted by eager politicians and bright young lawyers. But she wanted more. She told her sister she planned one day to be the wife of a president. One evening at a party at her sister's house, Mary noticed a man who said he wanted to dance with her in the worst way. And she added, he certainly did.
He is still a somewhat uncouth, rather awkward and ugly young man, but one who is ready to be accepted into the best social circles of the state capital.
He sees her first dancing with a whole bunch of beaux surrounding her. She's sensual, she's talking, really the center of attention. And here he is, still the gangly character, unsophisticated about women, unsure about women, awkward around women. She's 5 feet tall, he's 6 feet 4 tall, and most unlikely physical couple.
She was a gentle lady, and he was just one step up from a rube. She had position in society, and he didn't. He was still a wannabe.
Some even thought maybe he was courting her for financial advancement. But they had politics in common from the very beginning, and it got them over many a rough spot.
In 1840, the Whigs nominated for president a Virginia aristocrat whose supporters liked to claim that he lived in a log cabin, William Henry Harrison. Lincoln stumped Illinois for him and again ran for the legislature, while Mary cheered them both on.
I've become quite a politician, rather an unladylike profession, yet at such a crisis, whose heart could remain untouched?
She loved politics for its own sake, because Mary liked a challenge and she liked excitement. And I don't think he could find too many young women who were willing to talk about politics.
It's no accident that she fell in love with Abraham Lincoln. She sensed both his ambitions and his capacity to realize those ambitions of which she would be a part.
When the campaign was over, Lincoln had won, and so had his log cabin candidate, William Henry Harrison. By then, Lincoln's friendship with Mary Todd had ripened into something more. Lincoln, Mary's sister, wrote, would listen and gaze on Mary as if drawn by some superior power. He called her Molly. She called him Mr. Lincoln.
They shared a love of poetry. One can imagine them reading poetry aloud to one another and really loving it, not just reading it, but it touching some part of their heart. They shared a certain melancholy. They both had these emotional moods, these blackened periods. They shared a sense of loss in their mothers having died when they were young. She somehow saw the depths of this man. She saw inside of Lincoln.
Not long after Election Day, Lincoln asked Mary to marry him. and she agreed. Then, just a few weeks later, he abruptly told her he had changed his mind. He wrote a friend that the thought of marriage was indescribably horrible and alarming.
He was a very confused young man, struggling for love and intimacy. This is not a man who easily established intimate relationships.
He did not know how to make close bonds with really anybody. He never told his private thoughts.
He's terrified of getting married. His insecurity with women, his concern about intimacy, all made him, I think, just shy away from this commitment. There must have been a feeling that if he did give himself over to a woman again, as he had to his mother, as he had to Anne Rutledge, that perhaps the only result of that would be the loss of this woman that he loved.
Lincoln again fell into a black depression. He spent days locked in his room, unable to move, unable to sleep.
I am now the most miserable man living. If what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family, there would not be one cheerful face on earth. Whether I shall ever be better, I cannot tell. I awfully forebode I shall not. To remain as I am is impossible. I must die or be bitter.
They took the razors out of his room because they were afraid he was going to commit suicide. He was in utter despair, utter and total despair.
Mary eventually reappeared in Springfield society. Lincoln did his best to avoid her.
He deems me unworthy of notice. I would that the case were different, that he would once more resume his station in society, that he should be himself again.
Despite Lincoln's rejection, Mary waited.
There's absolutely no indication that he asked her to wait for him. On the contrary, there's every indication that he was not in touch with her at all. And she waited through in all of 1841 and half of 1842. She waited for an entire year and a half for him to wrestle his demons to the ground before he would come back to her.
On November 4th, 1842, to everyone's surprise, Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd stood side by side and exchanged vows. They were beginning a marriage which would be, at times, even more turbulent than their courtship.
Nothing new here, except my marrying, which to me is a matter of profound wonder.
The only house the Lincolns ever owned stood on the corner of 8th and Jackson Streets in downtown Springfield. Lincoln scraped together $1,200 to buy it in 1844. Here, Abraham and Mary would live for the next 17 years, share the everyday routines of married life, raise a family.
He moved quickly from living literally in log cabins to living in a house which, by any standards, represents the upper middle class of mid-19th century America. I mean, this is a guy who, once he left the prairie, once he got out of New Salem, he never went back.
Abraham Lincoln was certainly unschooled in the social niceties. Sometimes his shirts didn't match or his trousers were too short, and she groomed him in terms of his appearance, with one thing in mind, that he should physically live up in his appearance to the greatness of his mind.
Nine months after their wedding, their first child, Robert Todd Lincoln, was born. A second son, Edward, came 3 years later. Lincoln now took to calling Mary Mother.
He was a father, which was very important to him. He found love and affection with Mary. He adored her. How can one minimize the significance of finding love and affection from somebody? And to be able to love somebody as well as be loved in return.
He became a different man after his marriage. He didn't have to worry about his place in society. He didn't have to worry about courtship. He didn't have to worry about getting along with women. He could concentrate on the things that he did best, which was the man's world of politics.
Lincoln continued to build his reputation as a politician, while his work as a lawyer spread his name across the state. He rode the circuit from county courthouse to county courthouse, getting to know voters all across Illinois and picking up clients wherever he could find them.
He liked to get out among the people. And he liked the art form of being a trial lawyer, of getting into a county seat the night before the case was to be heard, meeting with clients, 1 or 2 law books, very few pieces of stationery and ink, and doing up a case very quickly and effectively. In fact, he became so good at being a lawyer that he was referred cases by lawyers who lived in these county seats. You go to the tavern the night before the case was to be heard. There's maybe a fire going in the fireplace. The food was dismal. You had 4 or 5 lawyers to a bed, 3 beds to a room. There was a camaraderie. This was a very male-oriented culture, and Lincoln loved that.
At night, he would swap stories with the other lawyers while the townspeople looked on, laughing. No one made them laugh harder than Lincoln.
His favorite jokes were ones which made him look bad or foolish, or jokes about his ugliness, jokes about his height.
He might say, well, I guess you wonder why I'm here. And I sometimes wonder myself why I'm here. And I'm reminded of the days back in Indiana when I was out chopping wood in the forest, and a woman came by on a horse. And she stopped and she looked at me and said, "My, you are the ugliest man I ever saw." And I said to her, "Well, ma'am, there isn't a lot I can do about it." And she said, "Well, you could have stayed at home."
He liked to make people laugh, and apparently he always laughed as loud as anybody. In spite of the fact that he was the funniest storyteller around, he was also a very gloomy man.
Lincoln told stories, a friend said, to whistle away the sadness. He was often withdrawn, given to spells of depression, which he called the hypo.
Depression separates you from other people in profound ways. It is lonely, it's isolating, and Lincoln's use of humor was an effective way to fight that, to fend it off. It was a deeply human kind of humor that connected with people, that deepened the bonds in whatever audience he found himself. And for him, it was vital to whistle off sadness because it helped keep the depression at bay.
While Lincoln rode the circuit, Mary stayed home with the children, where she found it hard going without her husband. She was haunted by fears of burglars, dogs, lightning storms. She suffered from blinding headaches, migraines that sent her to bed for days.
Whenever Lincoln left Mary, she experienced it as abandonment, pure and simple. She desperately yearned for him to be more available than he was. Now, for the most part, in the early years of their relationship, he did seem to meet most of those needs in her.
When he could, Lincoln tried to calm her, running home from his law office during the lightning storms that so disturbed her. But he was incapable of giving her everything she needed. He was not a demonstrative man, she once said. When he felt most deeply, he expressed the least.
Everybody liked him. No one was particularly close to him. So that his law partner, who sat in the law office with him every day for 16 years, when it was all said and done, asked about it, said, Lincoln was the most shut-mouthed man I ever knew.
And Mary blurted everything out. She blurted it out in letters to her friends. She talked and talked and talked.
I think Mary desperately yearned to have him there every moment. And yet, in her own confusions, when he was there, she would often get incredibly frustrated with his withdrawal.
Lincoln never lost sight of his political career, and in 1844, when a group of Whigs invited him to speak in Indiana, he accepted. But this would be more than a political journey. It would be a journey back into his past. Lincoln's boyhood home was not very far from Springfield. But he had never gone back, as if he were afraid to revisit the scene of his mother's death. Now, 35 years old, lawyer, legislator, husband and father, he felt he was ready. Lincoln never pretended to be a poet, but flooded by painful memories, he tried to turn his feelings into verse.
Near 20 years have passed away since here I bid farewell to woods and fields and scenes of play and playmates loved so well. The friends I left that parting day, how changed as time has sped. Young childhood grown, strong manhood gray, and half of all are dead. I range the fields with pensive tread, and pace the hollow rooms, and feel, companion of the dead, I'm living in the tombs.
Lincoln was discovering that language could help him confront his darkest nightmares. All his life, he would wrestle with words, struggling first to give expression to his own feelings, and then to those of his fellow countrymen.
Now, if you should hear anyone say that Lincoln don't want to go to Congress, I wish you would tell him you have reason to believe he is mistaken. The truth is, I would like to go very much.
In 1846, Lincoln ran for Congress and was elected as a Whig to the House of Representatives. At last, he had arrived. Sometime that year, the new congressman and his wife proudly sat for their first photographs. Lincoln was 37, Mary 28.
He is dressed up to have his picture taken because he is a man of importance. And yet you look at him and you still say, this is a pretty rough character. I'm not sure how far he can go. But you take a look at those eyes and you say, he thinks he's going somewhere, and he's really very pleased with himself. His hair is slicked down on his head. It would never stay there more than 5 minutes, but just long enough for this photograph.
You have the feeling that Mary had a brush with her right before this picture was taken, and she pushed it down so far that it doesn't even look like him. She looks very well put together. She looks stylish. There's an affectionate look on her face. There is a sensual quality to the way she's looking out at the world. She's dressed perfectly in silk, in lace. This is a woman who's established herself. You get the feeling that they've come somewhere together. He had been elected to the Congress. He was moving on to national politics. And beware, world, we're coming.
In 1847, Congressman-elect Abraham Lincoln, his wife Mary, and their sons Robert and Eddie arrived in the nation's capital. The city was alive with excitements to dazzle a provincial couple. Lectures and plays, concerts by the Marine Band. With its 50,000 people, more than 3,000 of them slaves, Washington was the largest city either of them had ever lived in. All four Lincolns moved into a single large room in a crowded boarding house, and Lincoln began his career as a congressman.
If you look at the congressional directory that he filled out himself during his only term in Congress, they have a section that says education, and he wrote in defective.
But Lincoln was in his element, delighting in cloakroom politics, learning how Washington worked, sending home more than 7,500 copies of his speeches, carefully addressing every envelope by hand. Politics were his life, his law partner remembered, newspapers his food, and his great ambition his motive power. He delighted in politics, he reveled in it, as a fish does in water, as a bird disports itself on the sustaining air. But while Lincoln flourished, Mary found only disappointment. She had come to Washington, a friend said, hoping to loom largely. But with her husband away all day, she was left alone, with two small, restless, noisy boys.
Most wives just stayed at home, especially for a first-term congressman before you were sure how things were going to turn out. But Mary was determined to come along, and they ended up in a boarding house with a lot of other crusty old politicians. And it was a very difficult time for her. She realized nobody was going to make a fuss over her husband, and what was she going to do with these two children? One was barely an infant.
Confined to a boarding house, with nowhere to entertain and nothing to do, Mary consoled herself by shopping, sometimes spending too much.
She had this habit of living beyond her means, of spending rather recklessly, and of having a very slippery regard for debts. And she was keeping it from her husband.
After just 3 months, she packed her bags, took the boys, and went back to her family home in Kentucky. With Mary gone, Lincoln lost himself in national politics. But no one in Washington paid any attention to his speeches or his proposals. He was frustrated and lonely.
Dear Mary, in this troublesome world, we are never quite satisfied. When you were here, I thought you hindered me some in attending to business. But now, having nothing but business, it has grown exceedingly tasteless to me. I hate to stay in this old room by myself.
My dear husband, I feel wearied and tired enough to know that this is Saturday night. Our babies are asleep. How much I wish, instead of writing, we were together this evening. I feel very sad away from you.
What did Bobby and Eddie think of the little letters Father sent them? Don't let the blessed fellas forget Father.
Do not fear the children have forgotten you. I was only jesting. Even Eddie's eyes brighten at the mention of your name.
My dear wife, last Wednesday, P.H. Hood and Company dunned me for a little bill of $5.38, and Walter Harper and Company another for $8.50, for goods which they say you bought. I hesitated to pay them because my recollection is that you told me there was nothing left unpaid. Kiss and love the dear rascals. Affectionately, A. Lincoln.
In the fall of 1848, Lincoln set out for New England to help whip up support for the Whig candidate for president, General Zachary Taylor. Mary and the boys came along too. They toured Massachusetts and New York, then set out to see Niagara Falls. There, Lincoln, still experimenting with words, tried to describe his feelings.
Niagara is strong and fresh today as 10,000 years ago. The mammoth and mastodon, now so long dead, that fragments of their monstrous bones alone testify that they ever lived, have gazed on Niagara.
Lincoln attempted a rhapsody on Niagara Falls, all about this torrential water and the turbulence and the excitement, what this all portended.
In that long, long time, never still for a single moment, never dry, never froze, never slept, never rested.
He broke off in the middle of it. This was clearly not his thing.
Lincoln never finished his meditation. He was still learning how to write, still falling short of the mark, still searching for his own voice. Zachary Taylor was elected president on November 7th, and 4 months later took the oath of office. Lincoln went to the inaugural ball, but his own term in Congress had expired the day before.
Lincoln's one term in Congress was a learning experience. That's about all you could say from it. It had no concrete accomplishments. He thought pretty much that his political career was dead.
Lincoln had promised to serve only one term. Illinois was overwhelmingly Democratic, and the chance to run for the state's only Whig congressional seat now went to another Whig.
So what political future could an obscure Illinois ex-congressman have? He was depressed, and he went home essentially defeated and largely withdrawing from politics for the next few years.
The Lincolns had been home just 9 months when they were struck a devastating blow. Three-year-old Eddie Lincoln became dangerously ill with tuberculosis. For 52 days and nights, his parents took turns sitting by his bedside. On February 1st, 1850, Eddie died. Mary collapsed. Her father had died the previous summer, followed a few months later by her beloved grandmother.
It took everything out of her, and for the first time, you began to see the side of her nature that refused to be comforted. that refused to accept.
Mary stopped eating. Lincoln, even as he grieved, reached out to comfort her.
Eat, Mary, for we must live.
It's as though Mary's despair is so total and so complete that it swallows up the capacity for him to grieve as well. What you see with Lincoln is not a disappearance of depression, but you find that he's able to control the depths to which he sinks.
"10 months after Eddie's death, William Wallace Lincoln was born. Willie, who was to become his mother and father's favorite, and seemed an almost miraculous replacement for the boy they had lost. Thomas, their fourth son, was born in 1853. His father nicknamed him Tad because his large head and small body reminded him of a tadpole. Lincoln was now more deeply involved in the law than he had ever been, arguing before the Illinois Supreme Court and earning the largest fees of his life as attorney for the Illinois Central Railroad. But he continued to keep up with the old unresolved issue that had now begun to consume the country. Slavery, which had divided America since its beginning, was threatening to tear it apart. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Law that gave slave owners the right to recapture runaway slaves. Abolitionists vowed to defy it. As African Americans were hunted down in the North, anti-slavery sentiment grew. Lincoln's law partner, William Herndon, an ardent abolitionist, remembered constantly urging Lincoln to speak out against slavery. But Lincoln believed above all in what he called reason, cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason. "Billy," Lincoln said, "you're too rampant and spontaneous."
He hoped that slavery would be ended. He believed it would be ended in time, but he felt that you couldn't just say, let it be done, and have slavery ended. There was nothing anybody could do about it except to say, as Lincoln himself had said, that we deplore the institution.
As the country seethed, Lincoln continued quietly to practice the law.
His legal career is flourishing. He's doing very well. He's getting more respected. He's making money. And he's happy that that's happening, but not really passionately fulfilled by that because his desires are elsewhere and they're not being met by legal success.
Mary Lincoln was unhappy too. Her behavior since Eddie's death had become increasingly erratic. She fired servant after servant, lashed out at neighbors, and at her husband. Lincoln was often away now, sometimes half the year riding the circuit. Even when he was home, he could remain distant and withdrawn. The political dreams the Lincolns had always shared seemed to be going nowhere. Once when he was reading his newspaper in front of the fire and paid no attention when Mary twice asked him to bring in more logs, she hurled a chunk of wood at his head.
There are clearly developing signs of Mary's fragility. She wants him to be involved in her life, to care, to attend to her, to listen to her. And her frustration leads to rage.
Friends noticed that Lincoln now seemed even more tinged by sadness than usual. His marriage was troubled and his political career at a standstill. His law partner remembered, melancholy dripped from him as he walked.
He's a man with great aspirations, but nothing to show for it yet. It was incredibly frustrating for somebody who dreamed of greatness to be a nothing in the public realm.
Then the Democratic senator from Illinois, Stephen A. Douglas, the man they called the Little Giant, changed everything. Until 1854, despite the fiery disagreements over slavery, there was still a fragile balance of power between North and South. But on January 23rd of that year, Douglas introduced the Kansas-Nebraska bill in Congress, based on what he called popular sovereignty. The bill would leave it to the people of the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether they wanted slavery. The South's peculiar institution now threatened to spread. With one stroke, Douglas had thrown the country into turmoil. Lincoln was arguing a case on the circuit when news reached him that the bill had passed. It roused him, he said, as he had never been before. He believed that under the Constitution, no one had the right to interfere with slavery where it already existed. But it must not be allowed to expand further.
It was the Kansas-Nebraska Act that brought him back on the scene and really got his blood up. The South kept saying slavery is a positive good, and as a positive good, it ought to have a right to spread anywhere. Lincoln was saying it's not a positive good. It's something that needs to be blocked up. It's something that needs to be stopped.
He did not favor abolition. He did not call on the southern states to end slavery, but he said slavery was a morally reprehensible institution which we cannot endorse. For the first time, he's able to connect a major public issue and a large moral question. There's a new tone in his speeches. There is a tone of high moral outrage.
This covert zeal for the spread of slavery, I cannot but hate. I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world, and especially because it forces so many good men amongst ourselves into an open war with the very fundamental principles of civil liberty, criticizing the Declaration of Independence and insisting that there is no right principle but self-interest.
He spoke out logically, he spoke out morally, he spoke out emotionally, and he found his voice. And I think once you make a stand like that, something changes inside of you. It gives you the strength and the fervor to keep going.
In 1855, Lincoln, now 46, ran for the Senate and lost. The following year, a new party was formed, the Republican Party, a party committed to stopping the expansion of slavery. Lincoln had to choose either the unproven Republicans or his own Whig Party, now split over slavery like the country itself.
Lincoln faced a political dilemma. You can't do anything in American politics, he once said, unless you're a member of a political party. But what party was he going to be a member of? You can so easily cut off your political future if you join a party that's going to die within a year. If it didn't work, you would be lost. And yet, in the long run, the Republican Party was the only place that he felt he could go, and it represented principles that he favored.
That summer, when the Republicans nominated the explorer John C. Fremont for president, the party had an energetic new member. Lincoln campaigned tirelessly for the Republican ticket, stumping the state, making over 50 speeches. Fremont lost, but Lincoln's hard work had paid off. The former Whig had won a loyal following and made himself one of the most prominent Republicans in the state of Illinois. By 1856, Lincoln had earned enough money to add a second story to their home. His law practice was booming. 47 years old, he now had a new party, a cause he believed in, and 3 boisterous boys. The Lincolns couldn't resist spoiling them, giving them the run of the house. Mary Lincoln seemed more relaxed. As the wife of a successful lawyer and a rising political star, she was enjoying the attention that now came her way.
She was a wonderful hostess. She was also a great sounding board. And when he would come home at the end of the day, they would talk politics. He would ask her opinion about this issue or that issue or this personality or that, and she would give it because she was his wife. She could be straight with him. She could be honest with him.
And they worked as a team politically. I think it's important to realize that in Lincoln's political activities, Mary was, if often unseen, a very stalwart supporter. She wrote letters for him. She gave parties for his political friends. She did the very best that she could to support him.
Quietly, Lincoln was working behind the scenes, waiting for his chance to run again for the Senate, this time for the seat held by Stephen Douglas himself. His chance came in 1858. On June 16th, in the Capitol building at Springfield, he accepted his party's nomination in an address he delivered by heart. It was the most important speech he had ever made.
A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the House to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other.
Lincoln challenged Senator Douglas to a series of debates. Douglas reluctantly accepted. The two men were renewing an old political rivalry. Lincoln had known Douglas for 20 years and had never liked him.
He disliked Stephen A. Douglas because Douglas was politically successful and he wasn't. Douglas got everything he wanted. He was elected to everything, to judge, to Congress, to senator. And look at Lincoln's record. One term in Congress he probably couldn't have won if he tried again. Defeated for the Senate in 1855. Everything that he wanted was always dashed from him, just as he's putting the cup to his lips.
It was a long, grueling campaign. Lincoln and Douglas each traveled more than 4,000 miles, delivering scores of speeches, often for 2 or 3 hours, in a contest that captured the attention of the country. Lincoln traveled by regular passenger train, mingling with the voters. Douglas outfitted his own train, with a cannon trailing behind on a flat car to pull in the crowds. The 6'4" Lincoln and the 5'4" Douglas faced each other 7 times. Lincoln was taking on one of the most powerful men in the Senate and one of the most skillful debaters in the country. Their arguments over slavery would define the issue for the whole nation. Why can't the country endure half slave and half free, Douglas asked. It had for 82 years, after all. I go for the principle of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, he argued. The right of the people to decide for themselves.
It would not do to minimize Douglas's very significant point. This is a free country, and if the people of Kansas, Nebraska, or other states choose to adopt the institution of slavery, that is their business. We should not interfere and impose our moral standards.
Lincoln countered that Douglas's reliance on majority rule was morally bankrupt.
It's as thin as a soup made by boiling the shadow of a pigeon that had starved to death.
Lincoln takes Douglas's argument that says that what the people in the territories decide is up to them. It's a democracy. If they vote for slavery, so be it. That's majority rule. And he says, no, there's an independent standard of right and wrong that's more important than the majority vote. Slavery is wrong. He believed so much that what the American system was all about was making it possible for other men to rise as he had done. But slavery was completely against that. A person worked hard, they labored, and yet the fruits of their labor belonged to somebody else.
Douglas tried to trap Lincoln by charging him with coddling the black man. Are you in favor of conferring upon the Negro the rights and privileges of citizenship? He asked Lincoln. I am opposed to Negro citizenship in any and every form. I believe this government was made by white men for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever. Lincoln's response was clear.
I have no purpose to introduce political and social equality between the white and the black races. There is a physical difference between the two, which, in my judgment, will probably forever forbid their living together on the footing of perfect equality. He is not my equal in many respects, certainly not in color, perhaps not in intellectual or moral endowment, but in the right to eat the bread which his own hand earns. He is my equal, and the equal of Judge Douglas, and the equal of every other man.
He was deeply ambivalent about the idea of racial equality in America. He says over and over and over again he does not believe the races are equal. He made a clear distinction. I hate slavery. On the other hand, I don't know what to do about ending slavery because I can't imagine that black and white can live together as equals in America.
The racial attitudes of 19th century America among white people were essentially that African Americans were an inferior people. This was an attitude that had been handed down since the nation evolved. There had always been this sense of African American inferiority because of the color of their skin, because they came from a foreign land that was considered a land of barbarism, because many people in the northern and western states listened to Southerners who said that African Americans would not work unless they were enslaved, that they were lazy, that they were shiftless, that the plantation system was a school for them to civilize them. So all of these kinds of stereotypes Lincoln heard, and unfortunately Lincoln believed.
In the middle of October, Lincoln took a steamboat down the Mississippi and met Douglas for the 7th debate at Alton, Illinois. For the last time, Douglas would argue that in a democracy, the majority rules. And once again, Lincoln would do his best to refute him.
The real issue is the sentiment on the part of one class that looks upon the institution of slavery as a wrong, and another class that does not. That is the issue that will continue in this country when these poor tongues of Judge Douglas and myself shall be silent. It is the eternal struggle between these two principles, right and wrong, throughout the world. They are the two principles that have stood face to face from the beginning of time and will ever continue to struggle.
It rained as Illinois voters went to the polls on November 2nd. The fizzle gigs and fireworks, as Lincoln called them, were finally over. The outcome would be decided by the state legislators, meeting in the Capitol building where Lincoln had accepted his party's nomination. The results were as close as they could be. Lincoln's Republicans polled 4,000 more votes, but Douglas's Democrats controlled the legislature. For the third time in his political career, Lincoln lost.
I feel just like the boy who stubbed his toe. I am too big to cry and too badly hurt to laugh.
Still, he was glad he had made the race.
It gave me a hearing on the great and durable question of the age, which I could have had in no other way. And though I now sink out of view and shall be forgotten, I believe I have made some marks which will tell for the cause of civil liberty long after I am gone.
Lincoln had lost the election, but his debates with Douglas had been reprinted all over the country, and he now had a national following. He held the middle ground, somewhere between the abolitionists and the slaveholders of the South. He continued speaking out across the Midwest, in Illinois, Kansas, Indiana, Wisconsin, and wrote notes for a campaign biography, which he introduced with characteristic self-deprecation.
Herewith is a little sketch. There is not much of it, for the reason, I suppose, that there is not much of me.
There was now talk that he might run for higher office than the Senate. Lincoln professed to be astonished. "Just think of such a sucker as me as president," he told a reporter, although his wife, he added, was confident he would one day make it to the top. Then, in early 1860, Lincoln eagerly traveled to New York, where he had been invited to speak. The front-runner for the Republican nomination for president that year was the popular senator from New York, William Seward. Lincoln would be speaking on Seward's home ground. It was a chance for the prairie politician to show the Eastern leaders of the Republican Party what he could do. 1,500 curious people crowded the auditorium at the Cooper Union Institute. Lincoln later admitted he was uncomfortable, unsure of his audience, unsure of himself.
Now, this is a man who entered the Cooper Union that night with his host genuinely concerned about the impression that this guy was going to make. This tall, angular, awkward man in clothes that didn't seem to fit him, and said things like Mr. Chairman. And frankly, most who were present said that when they first saw Lincoln, when he first stood up, their initial impression was, oh my goodness, this will never do.
But when Lincoln began to speak, doubts quickly vanished.
Can we, while our votes will prevent it, allow slavery to spread? If our sense of duty forbids this, then let us stand by our duty fearlessly and effectively. Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it.
The crowd rose to its feet when he had finished. No man, one reporter wrote, ever before made such an impression on his first appeal to a New York audience. He had proven he was a politician to be reckoned with, a serious candidate for president. The taste, he admitted to a friend, is in my mouth. On May 16th, the Republicans gathered in Chicago to pick their candidate for the highest office in the land. In a crowded field of candidates, the man to beat was still William Seward. Lincoln's own chances seemed slim.
Lincoln's qualifications in 1860 really paled compared to the other leading Republicans. His sole experience on the national level had been as a one-term member of the House of Representatives, but nothing that would have prepared him for the kinds of responsibilities that he would face as president. Most people wouldn't have given Lincoln much of a chance at all.
Lincoln didn't go to Chicago, but he saw to it that able lieutenants were on hand, determined to snatch the nomination for their man.
There was this tremendous passion for Lincoln inside the convention hall, due in part to some maneuvering by Lincoln supporters. They handed out duplicate tickets to make sure there were more Lincolnites there than Seward people. They hired professional shriekers, as they were called, these leather-lunged Midwesterners, to go in there and start screaming for Lincoln's nomination. Lincoln felt that his supporters could organize public sentiment on the convention floor and pull some backroom deals and things like that and carry the day.
His becoming a president was no accident. The wood fairy did not come down from the heavens and anoint him president and commander-in-chief. You just don't become president that way.
That man who thinks Lincoln sat down and gathered his robes about him, waiting for the people to call him, has a very erroneous knowledge of Lincoln, his law partner remembered. He was always calculating, always planning ahead. His ambition was a little engine that knew no rest. To relieve the tension while he waited for the results, Lincoln played handball at his home in Springfield. On the first ballot, Seward held a commanding lead. But Lincoln was running ahead of everyone else. On the second ballot, Seward began losing ground. He was considered too extreme in his opposition to slavery. Lincoln hoped his own reputation as a moderate would carry the day. He had given careful instructions to his supporters.
My name is new in the field, and I suppose I'm not the first choice of a very great many. Our policy, then, is to give no offense to others. Leave them in a mood to come to us, if they shall be compelled to give up their first love.
That is exactly what happened. On the third ballot, the Republicans at last united behind one man. The campaign to elect the 16th President of the United States was on. His name became known everywhere, but even his most ardent admirers were still unsure what he looked like. The opposition lampooned his looks and countrified ways. But to millions he became known as Honest Abe and the Rail Splitter, though no one dared call him Abe to his face, and he never wanted to split rails again.
Lincoln, by this point, was a prominent, very prosperous lawyer living in a good house in Springfield, well regarded in Illinois society with some national reputation. This was not a humble man of the people out chopping rails. On the other hand, there was a good deal of truth to this myth, and it was an immensely popular one as well.
Well, he went along with it. I don't think he initiated it, but he did go along with it. They brought to the hall actual rails that he supposedly split, and he said, well, I might not have split those rails, but I've split a rail in my day.
Thousands of people came to Springfield to pay Lincoln tribute. A parade of floats and marching bands blared past his gate. The candidate towered above the crowd. His excited sons hung out the windows. His wife looked on proudly. Mary Lincoln entertained now as never before. Newspaper men knocked at her door, eager to find out all they could about how the Lincolns lived, and Mrs. Lincoln eagerly showed them. The house was neatly without being extravagantly furnished, one wrote. An air of quiet refinement pervaded the place. There were flowers upon the table, pictures upon the walls. the hand of the domestic artist was everywhere visible. What a pleasant home Abe Lincoln has. Mary thrilled to all the attention she was getting. She delighted in talking politics with reporters, startling some of her husband's political allies by suggesting names for his cabinet.
She began to conceive of herself in a way that no Victorian political wife ever did, as an equal partner to her husband, as his chief advisor. And she went into the presidential election believing this. But Lincoln was a very shrewd politician, and he had another life that she didn't know about, involved with all these politicians, talking real strategy, the things that really were going to get him elected in the end.
That June, Lincoln's prospects dramatically improved. The quarrel over slavery had split the Democrats. Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas, who continued to champion popular sovereignty. Southern Democrats chose John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, who argued that slavery should be allowed to spread to the territories. There was even a fourth candidate, John Bell, whose only platform, he said, was the Constitution. With the opposition splintered, Lincoln suddenly became the favorite. He continued to insist that slavery must not move farther west, but pledged he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed.
Certainly, Lincoln was trying to reassure the South that he personally had no intention of interfering with their peculiar institution or their culture or their political power or anything else. And yet they were not hearing that.
Let the consequences be what they may, said a prominent Georgia editor. Whether the Potomac is crimsoned in gore and Pennsylvania Avenue is paved 10 fathoms deep in mangled bodies, the South will never submit to such humiliation and degradation as the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln.
To them, he was part of an organization, the Republican Party, that was bent on the destruction of their way of life, of their institutions, of their culture.
There were plenty of warnings that if this black Republican abolitionist, and that's what his opponents called him, was elected president, that it would provoke the southern states to secede. All kinds of people were warning that, but the Republicans said and thought that they were bluffing. Lincoln thought they were bluffing.
To Lincoln, the American Union was a sacred institution. It guaranteed every man's right to rise as he had risen. He couldn't imagine it disintegrating. As Election Day approached, Mary admitted to a friend she was tense with excitement.
Fortunately, the time is rapidly drawing to a close. A little more than 2 weeks will decide the contest. I scarcely know how I would bear up under defeat. I trust that we will not have the trial.
Election Day, November 6th. Lincoln and his supporters huddled in the state capitol, waiting for news. At 1:30 in the morning, it came. Years old, with less than a year's formal schooling, Abraham Lincoln had been elected President of the United States. But his victory was far from overwhelming. He had polled just 40% of the popular vote and had failed to win a single slave state. While fireworks raced across the Springfield sky, Southern politicians were already calling for an end to the Union. But Lincoln believed in the common sense of his fellow countrymen. He meant to be president of all the United States. As Lincoln stepped out into the street, a jubilant crowd of nearly 10,000 called for the president-elect to say something. Instead, he just waved.
I guess I'll go down and tell Mary about it.
When he neared home, he stepped up his pace and began to shout,
Mary, Mary, we are elected.
Everything for which the Lincolns had worked now seemed to be theirs. But they could not celebrate for long. Within 90 days, 7 southern states would secede. Threats to kill Lincoln began arriving daily. His election had shattered the Union he held sacred and would let loose a whirlwind.